All right, let's get started today. Today we're continuing talking about sources, but our focus today is going to be primarily on, once I find these sources, how can I tell whether this is going to be something that's useful to my paper? Just hold on one second. We mentioned on Monday that with respect to sources, one of the things that you have to make a determination is once you find sources between what is useful to you and what is not useful to you. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what are some ways that you can make that determination as to what is useful, what is not, but then also begin to talk about how do you incorporate those sources into your paper. So let's start off first by asking the question of what sources are. In a sense, sources, it seems like it would be obvious what a source is. But depending on how we look at a source is going to affect how we use it in our papers. So according to the book The Craft of Research, one good source is more than a score of mediocre ones, and one accurate summary of a good source is sometimes worth more than the source itself. So one of the things that becomes very important in doing research is what sources you find. If you find that good source, the source that is going to help you provide you the best type of information, that source is going to be greater than finding just a bunch of information that may or may not be useful. Furthermore, as you think about how that source is going to be used by you in your paper, a summary of the source, putting it in your own words, describing what's in there can actually be worth more than actually possessing the source itself. And so that's what we want to think about today. How do I determine what sources are good sources? And then how do I use them in such a way where they'll be advantageous to my overall research project? Sources essentially could be described in two types of ways. First, we can think of them as containers of data. Sources could be that information that you are looking for. That you're looking for data which you can interpret for your paper. These would be primary sources, but they would also be good secondary sources that help you find other information. But the secondary sources as well are ways to understand data, helping you find, right, so I have this data, how do I determine what is in it, how do I determine what's useful about it? And so there are some sources that are your core data, the data out of which you're working. And there are some other sources that are the data, there are ways to help you understand the data. Largely, of course, we're talking here about the difference between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are containers of data. Secondary sources are ways to understand data. In thinking about finding sources and discovering sources, one of the temptations is, in this day and age, just to go to the Internet. And the Internet, of course, is a very valuable tool in doing research. And it can save you a lot of time. It can get you access to a lot of information very quickly, where that type of information gathering in previous decades would have been a long, laborious process. And as we noted on Monday when we were looking through the different types of ways to find sources, that there are a lot of good Internet resources out there. And so in thinking about sources and the Internet, there are a couple of things that are important to consider. And so the Internet serves as a useful tool on this, because there are ways in which the Internet can help you find sources and find information that you wouldn't have been able to find otherwise. especially newer sources, newer information. You're going to find access to that much more rapidly through an internet search than you are going to find through going through books or commentaries, etc. What's also very helpful with the internet is that these days there are a lot of archives of information. There are a lot of libraries that carry digital information. Right? So you can, let's say you were doing some sort of historical report. There are some archives that have the papers of some particular famous person, and they've digitized them and made them available on the internet. Well, in previous generations, if you wanted to look at that information, you would first of all have to find out where it is, then you would have to go there, and then you would have to spend time looking through the archives. Hopefully it would be cataloged where you could find it relatively easily. But with the advent of digital archives, you can pull up copies of this information online, things that you would have had to spend a lot of money to go there and spend a lot of time going through and looking for this kind of information. Now, not all archives are digitized. There's a lot of archives that just don't have the funds or the machinery to digitize. So there's still some ways where, depending on what kind of project you're doing, the internet might not provide you access to that information, but these days more and more of it is available. In thinking about tools and sources, it's also important to recognize that the internet allows you to get brief overviews of topics. If you're in a position where your professor has said, do whatever you want on this particular topic. So you're taking one of the church history classes, and I say to you, I want you to do a project, a research paper on any aspect of church history. Well, there might be something in the lecture, you think, oh, that's really interesting, I want to do that, or there might be something in the reading I had to do and say, okay, this is really interesting, I want to explore that. But you might not have a lot of information, and so by doing an internet search, you might get brief overviews of some different things, maybe some things we didn't cover in lecture. Right? And so it helps you discover some things and narrow your topics. Of course, the internet is also a useful tool with connecting with other scholars, either through their blog posts or access to the writings online or just sending them an email. And so if you find a particular topic you're interested in, you find an article by a scholar and you're really interested in it, and you want to talk more with this scholar about it, you can get in contact with those people, a lot of them these days, provided they're alive, obviously. And so the internet provides opportunities for greater abilities in research. Finding sources, evaluating sources, things that previous generations didn't have. But the internet, like all types of information, should be read and understood critically. And there's particularly some things related to the internet that we have to be careful of and mindful of. First of all, it's very easy on the internet to find information that is false or misleading. Some of this might be intentional, some of it might be unintentional. And the intention, however, doesn't change the fact that it's wrong. Right? And so if you discover information, you might think that it's accurate. You write your paper up, submit it, only for your professor to say, this is actually bogus, this idea, this theory has been debunked, 50 years ago. But you didn't happen to discover it in your research. Right? So critically approaching that information. Furthermore, often a lot of the information on the internet can be very simplified. And so that in itself needs to be considered. Right? It provides you a good if you're looking at a topic, to kind of think of some directions to go, but you've got to move beyond some of that simplification. Because the internet allows all sorts of people to post just about anything they want in any sort of forum they want, there isn't any sort of control over rigor when it comes to truth or accuracy. Lack of citation is another issue that, again, it's not necessarily means the source is bad, but it might not be as useful to you because there isn't that kind of level of citation or rigor. Furthermore, of course, if you're looking at an academic journal, right, you find one through the online scholarly databases we talked about on Monday, you can feel pretty confident that the person you're reading is an authority in the field you're looking into. But when it comes to internet sources, there could be some ways in which the information that you find is you can't be sure. It could be anonymous, right? You don't know who wrote this, right? So you kind of, well, is this somebody that knows what they're talking about, or is this somebody else? So that uncertainty of the authority of the information can make it difficult and something that needs to be taken very seriously. No matter where you get your sources, though, whether that is through the internet or whether that is going to the library and browsing through the stacks, there are a couple of criteria that you can use to determine whether this source is valid, whether this source is useful, and that's basically what I want to talk about. I'll give you 4 criteria to think about with respect to evaluating sources. And again, we'll talk more about these in depth. One, of course, would be the author. I'm thinking through some of the things about who wrote this. What sources did the author use to produce this piece of information? Who is the audience for this piece? And now, sometimes, of course, you kind of have to guess. But then other times you can tell pretty quickly what it is. And then finally, the issue of accuracy. Is this information accurate? So let's talk about these in more detail, each of these in more detail. First of all, the author. There are a couple of things to think about when it comes to the author of a piece. In many respects, anybody can write anything. Right? And so depending on what sources you pull up, these days you can find all sorts of people weighing in on all sorts of topics. That's not unusual. That's happened for quite a bit of time. People sometimes speaking to fields that they're not necessarily an expert in. Right? Doctors speaking in things related to literature, or biblical scholars talking about biology. And those kind of things have happened before. Furthermore, and this isn't just, I don't want anybody to think that this is, the age of the internet. No, that's not necessarily the problem. I mean, with the way things are today, anybody can publish a book, even. And so you can't just say, okay, it's a book, so it must be, there must be authority, right? You can self-publish. There are vanity presses who, if you pay them money, they'll publish your book. All right, so there are a lot of ways in which author becomes very important. So in thinking about, all right, I found this source. Who is the author? Now, when it comes to that, again, an internet source may or may not have an author attached to it. Other types of sources usually will have some sort of author identified. So who is this person that wrote it? What are the credentials that this person has? Do they have an academic degree in that particular field that they're writing about? Again, simply because they don't doesn't necessarily mean you disqualify them, but it is something where you say, okay, you're not an expert in this from an academic standpoint, so I'm going to read this with a little suspicion. Take a little bit of, I'm not going to accept everything you say automatically unless it seems to make sense. On the other hand, sometimes expertise might be a good marker for evaluating an author. Because sometimes it's not necessarily the academic degree, but the experience in a field that might be helpful, again, depending on what your source is. If you're looking up something about ministry and you are wanting to include some reflections by ministers in your project, well, if somebody has just been a minister for 6 months, they're not going to necessarily have the kind of insight as somebody who's been a minister for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? So thinking about, all right, might be an issue of credentials. What credentials does this person have? But it also might be an issue of expertise. What experience do they have in the particular field? Is there a way to contact this person? Now, especially thinking about this in the context of the internet, where, is this somebody who's trying to hide who they are, or is it somebody who's open and upfront? Because that too might suggest some things, right? The contact information might tell you, okay, this is somebody that is connected with the university or somebody who's connected with the church. Right? But if you just have a general email address or those kind of things, then, again, it's not necessarily you discard it, but maybe you approach it a little bit more suspiciously or you question a little bit more. And so thinking about what can I tell about this author? Now this doesn't have to be a very extensive process where you spend days trying to discover information about the author, but you should be able to find some things pretty quickly to determine about the author. Sometimes with not so much journals or monographs, but sometimes on the internet you'll see a corporation as the author or some sort of nonprofit organization where it's on a nonprofit site but the actual author isn't revealed. And so that's when you say, okay, what can I tell about this particular group? And, do they have the expertise in this particular field? Or do they have credentials? And so thinking about that in case you don't have information about the specific author.